Eccoci, buongiorno, benvenuti.
Good morning and welcome. Welcome to the discussion forum that is being curated by the economist of voice.info, economisti della voce.info. Here we're talking about topics related to this festival, as well as to other topics, as we have seen in the last 2 days, that are very topical these days. So new poverties, new social networks, and we've seen that during the pandemic there has been an increase in the number of the so-called new poor, 1 million according to the Italian Institute of Research, ISTAT. So these figures can be traced back to something like a Third World War, but we've seen with Professor GORI, whom I will introduce recently, we have discussed these topics by and large, also on the Corriere della Sera, the newspaper I work for. And we would like to see what are the new networks, what are the new networks made of. There are instruments made available by the state, and we will talk about this instrument more thoroughly. And then there are some people that are neither with the state nor with the market. So we have seen that there are now that there are some actors that are very important in society. And I'm referring to the so-called third sector networks. Let me introduce our guests and how we're organized. Professor Baldini, who is sitting at the far left, is the economista della voce, who will introduce the topic that we will then discuss all together. Unfortunately, we don't have much time. We have 1 hour, 1 hour and 10, including questions from the floor. So Professor Baldini, who is a professor at the Università di Studi di Modena e Reggio Emilia, will give us an introduction shortly. And then we will have Rossella MICCIO. Rossella MICCIO is the president of Emergency, and I would like to thank you very much for being at the festival, and in particular, thank you for participating to this panel discussion. So the question is, why wasn't she invited when talking about health care? Well, we will explain this shortly. And then Professor GORI, who is a professor at the University of Trento, so he's from this city, and is the author of a text that is fundamental for us all, so combating poverty, with La Terza publishers. And thank you, of course, to La Terza for organizing this festival and for providing this forum discussion. Now, we also have, remotely, Professor FRANCA MAINO, who teaches political sciences at the Statale University Milan and is the director of laboratories on the second welfare, so a very well-known personality in the sector, and she's a member of the scientific committee for the Alliance Against Poverty. So welcome. And then Professor WESTERBARKEY. Hi, Professor WESTERBARKEY. Can you hear us? So thank you for being with us. And Professor WESTERBARKEY deals, or is here, as an expert of financial education, which is a great tool to combat poverty.
Diciamo lo scivolamento.
So to combat the fact that we are going towards poverty. She is vice chair of the Investor Education Committee of the IFAMA. Is this correct?
Please.
investor education platform, and so I work for Fidelity International, who is a global asset manager with 600
purtroppo
about investor education.
Purtroppo non abbiamo sentito bene, ma poi ci torniamo, spieghiamo bene tutto.
Thank you very much. We will further go into the details later on. And Professor Baldini, please, you have the floor. Good. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I've been asked to give you an introduction concerning the general topic of this meeting. Of course, there would be so much to say, and I'm sure I'm not going to be able to say everything, but new poverty and new social networks, the welfare state in more general terms. Now, thinking about the title of the festival this year, the state is coming back. So, and considering the welfare state as well, well, we know that the Italian state has never fled away. The social spending, public social spending, has increased remarkably in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but it also increased in the last 20 years, and after the year 2000, all the social spending items have increased as a percentage of the GDP. So pensions, family, invalidity, all of these items have grown remarkably, so there's a strong demand for social expenditure for many different reasons. The main one is that the Italian economy has not been growing for a long time now. Productivity is not growing either. We're the only country which in 2019 couldn't make up for the per capita income of 2007, that is before the 2008 crisis. Then we had the new Covert crisis with a GDP fall of some 10%. And for sure, in this context, we see that the number of families that are in need is increasing. So this is the first topic that I would like to discuss with you. So how have the economic conditions of families changed both before and after the COVID crisis? What are the effects of the new demands vis-à-vis our welfare system? So, and how has the welfare system reacted to the new needs expressed by society? And we know that changes in the welfare state have been going on for a long time now. So it's not that things were stuck before the COVID crisis and then changed. Let's go back some 15 years ago or more than that. There was no such a thing as a minimum income or basic income. Subsidies have been subject to a reform twice during the last 2 years. So it's a continuously changing process. And within this scheme, we've had the COVID crisis, which has generated new needs. So basic income has only been here for a couple of years, slightly more than 2 years, but that was not a sufficient measures. We've had to introduce new temporary measures, the emergency income. Then we have had many bonuses being utilized as an interim measure to make up for various difficult situations and conditions. And in 2020, 1,600 new aid schemes for families or enterprises have been put in place, an enormous number of aids, which gives you the dimension of these sizes that is totally different to the 2008 crisis when we had the austerity. So nobody's saying now that we have to go back straight to rebalancing the public balance sheet or budget. So what is happening in Italian society and in Italian economy, and what are the needs going further? And the second question is, how is the welfare system performing and how should it change? We don't have an ideal welfare system. 25 years ago, a well-known economist, Anthony Atkinson, wrote an article. He was also a guest of this festival. And so his article was actually a question: is welfare state an obstacle to economic growth? So the burden of proof had to be provided by those who had to defend the welfare state from being charged of hampering economic growth. But actually, the welfare state is not doesn't have the objective of favoring economic growth, but rather to protect people from life risks, be it disease, old age, poverty, or other situations. Well, the question remains, is welfare an obstacle to growth, or can it be something that favors economic growth? And Atkinson said, well, it depends on how the welfare state is constructed. We could have a harmful welfare state for economic growth, or the contrary, rather, as it invests in favor of the human capital of our young people, is in favor of health, or goes in favor of health, and protects you if you want to risk in some activities and know that something could go wrong. But our welfare system is very much unbalanced towards pensions and money transfers, services, and also in the case of the basic income money and direct money transferred to families has been carried out immediately, whereas the services, not just in relation to COVID, is still stuck where it was. So the problems with COVID, of course, pushed much more the money transfers side of these whole stories. So we need to change the welfare system we have inherited from the past and think of new social risks. So welfare system that should be much fast in reacting when things change and when the new prospects of the families and the people change due to a lockdown or due to the shutdown of a major company or due to an earthquake or any other event. We also have new technologies that aid us to identify new possibilities, new services, and to intervene rapidly. So we need to reconsider and reconfigure the system we have inherited from the past, and also consider how the specific COVID crisis can produce new changes. And the risk is that after all these events, in next autumn, we will discussing once again the issue of our pension schemes, and so we will have to think once again what to do to make up for the problems we have with the pension schemes. And another problem is the relationship between private and public welfare systems. And in all countries are investing more and more due to the crisis in the public welfare state. With Biden, the United States have decided not to go for the monetary transfer, but rather to act in favor of the same solutions adopted in Europe. But in general, our welfare public system suffers from a few limitations. The first one, the burden that is dominating the future of public welfare is aging. Aging poses new requests for aid both for pensions and healthcare system, and produces new political majorities that are in favor of such an investment. So it becomes more difficult to intervene in order to make up for the new social risks on top of the old ones that need to be tackled. Then our debt, public debt, which is also a major burden and can limit the public welfare action that seems to be unbalanced towards monetary investments. What is the relationship between public and private welfare? How can the third sector offer services and meet the demands that the public system cannot cater for all the reasons I mentioned? So I believe that we have a lot of topics to discuss, and this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. Perfect.
Thank you very much. Congratulations. You remain within the time limits. Mr. Gori, you are now involved. Let's talk about national instruments, how they worked, what happened during the pandemic, and what are the prospects for the future. Scientists stated that we are in the age of pandemic, so this is not going to be the last shock. Thank you very much. Let's start from the key words of poverty. The first is growth. Poverty has been on the increase constantly since 2008. The past year is not an exception. These are trends which have been worsened by the pandemic, but they have been there much longer. A second point in this time of fragility is that poverty is cross-sectional. Till 2008, it used to affect certain groups. Now it's affecting other groups who used to feel safe. It used to be in the south. Now it's up in the north. In the past, it was on the unemployed. Now it's enough to have one child and you might be poor. Then the rapidity of impoverishment. It is true that Italians have assets and heritage, but they are inequality. They are unevenly distributed, so it takes just a short time to get poor. How can we assess the measures to be used? Speaking about the role of the state, we have to separate quality and quantity. At the time of the COVID, indeed, in the absence of the measures adopted, poverty would have rocketed. We don't know to what extent, but it would have increased. Then the quantity of funds made available is good. We had the ordinary measure since 2019 of the citizenship income. There used to be another system before, but with less funds. Now, the present income is well financed, and then emergency income and the municipal tickets, we can call them, vouchers. What are the lights and the shadows? Professor Baldini conducted good research. Half of the poverty does not receive the citizenship income, and in the north there is a large group of people not covered, and also the family with many members. There are many families who are not protected. 1/3 of the people getting the citizenship income is because of the structure of the measure and not because they are poor. The main measure, the emergency income, was taken by 4 people entitled out of 10 because it was very difficult to apply and obtain emergency income. So the responses given are good, but the quality of funds is not enough. In a couple of years, if we are reinvited here, we will be here to speak about the next coming back, i.e. budget constraints. And the situation will be different, i.e. there won't be such a high public expenditure. What is the society of the future? The risk of poverty is larger and larger at all levels, and we'll have budget constraints coming back. It will be key to channel resources to those who are really in need, and this is the challenge. The citizenship income provides many funds but does not solve many other problems. So will the Italian government, the present and the future, be able to consider the society and say that it is necessary to help people who were not supported and no longer help those who had the aid. Will institutions be able to do that? It's not so easy. But in a situation where there are budget constraints, if I'm not able to move money, I would not be able to support those who are badly in need. So the next challenge is to channel resources to those who really need them. We will be able to respond by adding and subtracting. So the state will have to work on the quality and not only on quantity. If we were to say the worst concern, we are no longer able to make complicated decisions. We are just asking for money. But this is when we say we have not enough money, this is usually the time when you don't want to make difficult decisions. So we adopted simple solutions and will have to get more difficult solutions. There is a final point. You said the coming back of the state. There are many sectors of the welfare, such as poverty and children. The state is not coming back. The state is late. So we will need to be more indulgent on present members of government and less indulgent on the governments of the past 40 years. Baldini said there is a lack of services. Yes, because if we have been discussing the fight against poverty 20 years ago, it takes a lot of time to hire staff to provide services. It will take years. Had we adopted measures against poverty at the beginning of the year 2000, we would be in a better position. Then another solution, what is called a single check for families with children, an issue debated since the 80s when the demographic crisis was already there. Then the support to non-independent elderly persons. So there are new social risks which are not covered, children, people not self-sufficient and poverty. We are doing the right things, but at the wrong time. We are late, so there are so many poor, not enough new babies born, and so on. Doing the right things in the wrong moment is a bit more difficult. In these discussions, I usually, accept criticism against the government, but we learned in this time to reconsider the choices made starting from the 80s in order to allocate the liabilities and responsibilities to the different generations. Well, Stiglitz said that neoliberalism is over. It failed. The damages that we see today, you're right, is the fact that the political choices made were wrong. Inequality is a choice, unfortunately. I would like to give the floor to Rossella MICCIO. You are the president of the Emergency Association. So what about including those who are excluded? Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting us here. We have always been dealing with health. That was something, in a way, mandatory, that of caring people who, were affected by the health crisis and then by the economic and social crisis, which was a consequence of the pandemic. I agree on the key words which were mentioned earlier on. Indeed, it is true. These conditions are there. We have seen these problems in this year, during which we have supported those we call the new poor. We started from the city of Milan, which is the headquarters of emergency, and then it was scattered throughout Italy with different methods and different approaches. And at times we discovered very painful situations of people who were really suffering. On the one hand, we have a project that is called Nobody is to be Left Out. I mean, if we want to be a united single society, we have to involve everyone. So nobody should lag behind. So what is the organization doing? So based on the immediate response, i.e. lockdown, delivering food at home to those who were locked down, we also discovered that there were many people who remained unemployed, alone elderly people or families who were able to manage primary needs and who all of a sudden were excluded. The public response was inadequate simply because they were not able to identify those really in need. And these people had no way to communicate their new needs. So we invented this very simple project. We deliver food and also sanitary products, cleansing and things and so on to these people. I mean, those people who were excluded from the benefits of the traditional welfare system. And that was because of a number of reasons. Many welfare actions are delivered based on the official income of these people, and many had lost their income all of a sudden and were not known by the welfare system. So we also involved young persons associations in Rome and Milan dealing with circular economy and who were very familiar with the local community. So we identified a number of people which we do not call beneficiaries. I like to call them persons. And we started with a very clear message to them and the institutions and the municipal authorities and so on. The message is this. This is a support which will not last forever. We will be monitoring this support, checking that the prerequisites still are there, i.e. the most vulnerable groups. We told them we will do a monthly assessment to continue or discontinue the support. A second message was for the institutions. That is, this is a time of emergency, but the target is to help these people to come back to their ranks, i.e. to find a job and so on. And indeed, I must admit that it was pretty successful. Besides the differences between the north and the south of the country in terms of needs, in the north, for example, having a house or a home has a major impact in terms of spending the income. In the south, this is not so serious because they have family networks. In the south, there is a problem to receive health care. There is a problem of access. Okay, we'll come back to that. But let me tell you, the triage system you use really function. Yes, I mean, you said, I'm not classifying you as a poor person. I want to know who you are, what are your needs, do you need to have food supplied, your children are learning from home, and so on. Yes. Then what do you provide in these packages? We'll speak of that later. Miss MAINO.
Can you briefly summarize what we just mentioned? The second welfare, is it functioning? Is it not? I'm turning actually, but there's no point in me turning because I have a screen also in front of me to see you. So what about the non-functioning of a stress test, if ever, which has been going on since March 2020? Well, good morning, everyone, and I must say that the words of the previous speakers have already told us a lot in terms of the events we have had to face during the pandemic, and also in terms of spotting poor people or people at risk of poverty and new poverty as well. As Cristiano Gori mentioned earlier, this poverty is not just poverty, material poverty anymore. It is multifaceted, and it needs different approaches that are multidimensional, hence requiring very different forms of energy and the contribution of different actors, not just public institutions, but also private players in the non-profit area, in the third sector, as we call it, and that is so broad and so different. But I believe that some answers have also come from the production sphere. So if the topic is how should we care for poor people and the new poverty, then we have to consider different levels. We have the national measures and the basic income, as well as the REM, the emergency income introduced during the crisis in 2020 as a response to the COVID pandemic, and also considering resources made available from the government that have been cascaded down to the local governments. This was the first expression of this first crisis that has generated a poverty crisis, a food crisis, and I'm thinking of the tickets that have been provided to the families for the purpose of purchasing food as a basic aid. And also we have to consider how the regions, the local governments have to react, and the neighborhoods, the regions, the local authorities have been capable of reacting timely to phase 1 and 2 of the crisis, while at the same time we have to consider how we will proceed from now going further, because, you know, the first responses were a kind of a springboard for catering for material needs, but now we have to see how these people can be properly reabsorbed into the labor market, how to care for fragile children and the families and so on. So I believe that partially the response to that challenge that has been highlighted here is shifting attention from the national to the local level, to the different regions that I believe can become, and have partially already done so, that they can become laboratories for social innovation and for social investment, which means that this welfare system does not only apply to a need, but they become an engine for further development, going back to what Baldini was saying earlier. So there is a problem here, because at the regional, at the neighborhood level, we can't evaluate their ability to react and respond only considering the spending, their spending capacity, as it is quite low compared to the investments made by the state. We're talking about slightly more than 7 billion euros, 0.4% of the GDP. But the way in which we have to reconsider this local areas is the possibility of enacting collaborations with multi-actors, with many players, hence enhancing the value coming from non-public entities. So at the local level, we have seen, even before the pandemic crisis, and as a response to the 2007 and 2008 crisis, that public and non-public actors have been becoming organized within networks thanks to funding and external forms of supports that have given them a chance to work together, to experiment with the new interventions, and to try and co-produce responses. And I'm not, of course, trying to hide from you that there are other challenges that have to be faced at the local level. So the problems aren't just there at the local level, but we know that these risks can enable us to cater for the problems at the local level. And I know we don't have much time, but amongst the problems we have is the local fragmentation, the national fragmentation. So looking at the local entities as areas that should overcome this fragmentation is not something we can establish at the national level. Then there are different differentiation in the treatment or certain matters. Some areas are better equipped with instruments to do so. And then the dispersion of resources. We know that some resources may be provided by the PNR resilience plan, recovery and resilience. They provide resources that, if utilized well, can help us resolve the problems in a systemic manner. So we have to avoid wasting these resources. And another challenge that is before us is the risk that emergency responses that in many cases have been effective cannot sustain the challenge of sustainability and cannot provide a certain level of continuity to the interventions adopted until now. So I'm referring in more detail to the fact that administrations do have to invest in coming months and coming years. And I would like to mention another thing. Do you agree with Mr. Gori when saying that we're used to thinking that poor people are mainly in the south, but aren't poor people also in the northern part of the country? Also, as Baldini mentioned before, this all started well before the pandemic. Switching off the lights of the Milan fair and exhibitions of the Salone del Mobile, the furniture exhibition, and of course this has caused that many precarious workers have become jobless. So in the north, there's a big problem with the new poor and new poverty. So maybe this is also something we should face during our conversation. Professor Westerbarkey, why don't we close with you this first talk? Do you follow translation or do you understand Italian?
In English and interventions from
abbiamo un problema col microfono.
Of this conference. Thank you for management perspective as if
E c'è un problema di collegamento. La interrompo. Excuse me.
Sorry for interrupting you, but we have a problem with the connection. We can't hear you.
Se riusciamo
Sorry, see if we can resolve this. See if we can resolve this problem with the connection. Maybe you can be with us at the end.
Se qualcuno ci dice come possiamo procedere. Lo facciamo. Allora, scusate, ci ricolleghiamo.
So sorry, we will reconnect with you at the end of this presentation. So we will continue translating, and we will go back to Professor Gori. So we have been talking about new poverty, young people, of draft contribution to be given to the families, but there's something that has been probably neglected, and I'm talking about those proposals that have been partially included in the recovery plan, and I'm referring to those welfare options devoted to the elderly population. Yes, thank you. The care offered to non-self-sufficient elderly is something that was badly needed, because we have been talking about this national reform since the 90s, and in the PNR plan this was not included as part of the plan during the Conti government. So we have put forward a proposal that we have submitted to Minister Orlando and Speranza, and they have actually evaluated it, increased the investment levels, and the reform will have to be adopted or approved of by the year 2023. This is one thing that I would like to maybe go back to in the future. So, care to the elderly. I would like to mention 3 topics concerning the allowance for elderly people. So maybe in 2 years' time you will invite us to debate the topic of the sole or single allowance for the elderly people. It is part of a reform package that have come in very slowly. So the single allowance should increase funding for economic support with families with children. It simplifies things because we only have one single allowance, and there are no differences between employees and autonomous workers. So the objective of better supporting families that have children, well, that objective has been attained, but there's yet another objective that is very much linked with this, which is to increase the birth rate, to make the birth rate go up again, which is going to be a very complicated objective. So it's very hard to attain it, and the problem has been known since the 80s, at which started back then. It would have been easier to attain that objective because, you know, if I'm optimistic about the future, maybe I will invest on my children. In this economic phase, there's no such thing. And the second reason is that for public policies to encourage me to have more children, then it means that the population will have to be certain of being aided by the state. It's a long process. So as a minimum, it will require a lot of time now. This is the first and very important point. During this historical phase, we have to do the right thing in the best possible way to obtain results. The second point I would like to propose, and Baldini has written it very clearly on his newspaper. For which children is this allowance for? Who is the welfare state, therefore? Well, this allowance should go to families with children and should be distributed according to the economic status of the family to the and I think that the debate on this topic is emblematic of the welfare system we have in front of us. So there is a universalist option. So you could provide the same amount, the same to all the population, to all the families with kids, or adopt a more selective stance and concentrate resources and give more to the poorest people among that population bracket. Of course, in favor of universalism, we have at least two things to mention. First of all children are the same. They're all equal. Baldini said, if you don't treat it as a universalist thing, then there is a society that is funding the welfare and others who receive the welfare. But that will reduce consensus towards welfare in future respect, because also medium and high brackets have to receive aids from the welfare system. But there are also arguments in favor of selectivity. For example, the diffusion of inequalities and the fact that society is moving backwards. You don't only need policies in favor of the very last people in the scale, but you need measures for each and everyone within that scale. So I would like to mention that the debate on this single allowance should make us ponder the key question of the future years. Who is this social state there for? And this is for sure a topical issue. And there's another element that I haven't grappled very well. So is it good, is it positive to link policies in favor of women to the policies in favor of the families with kids? So this is surely a very important topic.
I mean, if the problem comes from the the issue of women are those who care for children. There are three things for the family where children: the economic allowance, kindergarten, and we are still lagging behind with family leaves, for example, i.e. that one is the one allowing children and those who are in care to be supported through family leaves. Indeed, there is also an issue on the availability of funds. I mean, we have progressed on those who accept that a family is in charge of caring, and that has to be supported. And there is an issue of culture in terms of labor market and so on. Anyway, the welfare system that we have to implement is one that see to it that policies to support family with children are that concerning with the issue of support to women. Thank you very much. That was a proposal made by Alesina in one of the past festivals and was published on the Corriere della Sera. Mrs. Miccio, back to you on the model that you have put to the test. Speaking about northern Italy, indeed, it is true that you have an important headquarters in Milan. Indeed, starting a project from Milan and providing aid and support for inclusion all over Italy. Well, indeed, we have been active since 2006 where mobile and not mobile centers. We have realized that we have an increasing number of Italians who are in need of support and who asked for our services. What we saw happening in Milan is this sudden disappearance of the abilities and capabilities of persons who were not the very last, but who were the last but one, or who indeed fell in absolute need, and they had no tools to manage that. They also were not, they didn't have the frame of mind to do that. In northern Italy, there were people included in our program who were not using the citizenship income or other forms of support. I mean, I realize that it's also difficult to accept and admit that you are a poor person. A couple of months ago, I was told that we had telephone calls from young freelancers who said, we managed up to now, but we can no longer manage lawyers and things like that. Indeed, freelancers who were no longer able to go on. They had no support at all. They just wanted to remain independent from their families of origin or their parents. So the question we are dealing with is this: how can we continue to support these people in a different way? And we hope we could indeed look at the end of this year to fully implement our No One is Left Out project, so that we can continue to support those in need with a target to include people and help citizens speak with the institutions. So poverty has to be identified from the bottom. I mean, it's like a door-to-door approach. Yes, this is what we did. Also because we were active at community level, and we had more time to devote to these people. That is a key element. Involved, and that's why I don't call them beneficiaries. You have to take the time to listen to them, to identify their needs, to talk with them, so that we can identify solutions together. In part, it's a limitation affecting public institutions, as we saw in healthcare at community level. And that emerged during our project to support the new poors. The interaction among different fields, volunteers, non-profit, public institutions, is a key element. We can be a sort of bridge to help different systems grow together and develop a new one. This is indeed, these are the different partners of this alliance. Ms. MAINO, what about the North and the idea of a new alliance among the actors? Sorry, I continue to turn towards the screen. Thank you very much. Going back to your words, indeed, poverty is to be identified from the bottom, but things would be much easier if the data bases of the country could be talking to each other, so that the data could be made available to the local governments, so that we could have a much more integrated approach to people and their needs. I think that an investment could be made nationally to do that, to connect the different databases in line with rethinking the use of new digital tools. As for your question, Cristiano is right. Statistical data confirm that poverty is on the increase in the north. It was already increasing before the pandemic. Maybe the north was able to react more promptly to the challenge. Why? Because we have institutions and society organizations who are active, and I'm referring to social networks, new governance models, which have started working in 2012, when there was the peak of the financial crisis. That, indeed, was also supported by bank foundations, community foundations, corporate foundations, who invested in supporting and creating the networks. I'm not saying that these are the networks who have to be the only actors. I suggest that, as it happened in the center-north areas, we should involve all the actors, because it is there that these networks should be supported, and also to spend and allocate them correctly against poverty. Going back to the new poverties, I think that investing in new welfare structures hinged on services, in order to offer services instead of funds, should be targeted in balancing the burden of care in favor of the elderly, disabled, children, and so on. Investing today in a new welfare state, putting the services at the center, and also investing on the matching between work and family, means investing, taking on board how people change throughout their lives. Needs are different. They should be identified at the beginning, i.e. investing on children, on young persons who should be able to enter the labor market, then adulthood, and also supporting those who are aging. We have to be aware that the fact that the elderly are not sufficient at a certain moment in time is one of the consequences of the fact that life expectancy is longer and people lose their autonomy after years. Last but not least, the changes in family structures. That is the increased number of single people and people who live alone. That should be tackled with in synergy between the center and the communities. Thank you very much. Now we are told that Mr. Westerbarkey is back. Good afternoon.
If you can hear me now, okay?
Okay, perfect. Okay.
Very good. And I'm sorry about the technology. I will keep my points very succinct to the in the interest of time. So I agree with what the panelists covered, and wanted to add that now with the pandemic, we see the gap widening between the rich and the poor, because many people that were in lower income jobs like transport, hospitality, tourism, they may have not been able to work and they had to live off their savings. So especially for that population, it's incredibly important that they think about their long-term savings to avert poverty in the later age. The question is how to do that. The first is investor education is really important at every stage of someone's life. It is, according to the OECD, proven that the earlier we start with children at school with investor education, the more successful they will be able to build financial health throughout their life cycle. But even within each step of the life, it's important to, of course, refresh that knowledge on finance. And one very common misconception is that most people think they have to be rich before they can actually save or invest, but that's wrong. Even with people that have a lower income, it's important that their mindset shifts, that they realize even with small amounts every month that they save, they can build a better financial future for themselves. And here there's a second misconception, that most people think they can save money on a bank account and then they'll be fine later in life. But the point is, we know because of inflation, because of the current low interest rate environment, it's very important to achieve a mind shift with regards to that point, that people invest in investment funds for the long term. Then they participate in the growth, especially now with all the EU recovery funds. We want the retail sector to be able to participate in the next growth phase, and they will only be able to do that if they invest small amounts of money into these types of newly created funds that are long-term and infrastructure funds, and they have a low risk, but they have a long-term return. And last but not least, it is important to incentivize people, not just for their own financial health, but also to use the fact that consumers are very interested in the environment and in saving the planet and in having better communities. So a very popular theme today is sustainable finance. We want people to participate in sustainable funds. And with that, we believe we can mitigate some of the threat of poverty at all social layers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Le vorrei chiedere questo.
Thank you. I would like to ask you a question. Professor Luzardi, a common friend of ours, supports the idea that financial education should not come as a top to bottom approach, so top-down approach, as it happens today, but should rather be developed closer to the people. So everywhere, also in leisure spaces or at the hairdresser or in theaters. So should be there where people live and act.
Absolutely, I 100% agree. And I wanted to also add the importance of technology nowadays, because everyone or most people, regardless of their wealth now, have access to the internet, and it needs to be more in our day-to-day life. And from a public policy perspective, we see that the European Commission has just launched an initiative within their Capital Markets Union, the CMU action plan, and they want to create a framework. So they want to help member states, including Italy, to do more that is accessible to the people that have no major finance background. For example, the IVAS, the Istituto per la Vigilanza sulle Assicurazioni, has a new education project under the OECD, but also the Italian government has launched something, I think it's pronounced Quello che conta. So they have a website where people can find information on savings, on the first jobs, on buying a home, on planning a family. But I fully agree, it needs to be around us, the fact that financial issues matter when you go to the supermarket, the hairdresser, not just in school, not just in a class, but it needs to be in the TV news. What is, however, important, we as Fidelity and as industry, we do a lot to inform our clients, and we had a specific seminar, especially for women in finance, because women have a greater need to plan than perhaps men, because statistically they live much longer, so they need to plan for a longer life and hence finance, often they have income gaps because of childcare or care for the elderly. And third, often they don't earn as much as men. So they need to give it much more thought. And they have, so to say, a tailored approach to their own finance, because we're talking about on our panel, especially the needs for children, for women, and for the elderly. So it's very important in financial education to target specific groups for their individual needs. And just one final remark that I think is very important is we as industry, we do a lot of initiatives to inform our clients or the public, but effectively only the public sector, so the schools, the governments, and the local municipalities can deliver financial education in an independent and in a holistic way. So our contribution is very important. But for example, Fidelity would, of course, talk about asset management, whereas other institutions might cover more insurance or they might cover more banking. Hence, the role of the public sector to provide investor education is increasingly important more than ever. Thank you very much.
Grazie, questo è molto importante, specie quello che ha detto.
Yes, this is very important, especially concerning the literacy, the financial literacy of women. And in fact, especially in Italy, the face of poverty is very often coincides with the face of a woman with an income gap and with children, of course. So thank you very much for your contribution. And let me repeat the name of the website. In spite of the fact you said it very well, the website is called Quello che conta. So it's very well conceived and designed. Go take a look at it, because it contains a lot of practical information concerning the financial choices we make throughout our life. So everything is a financial decision or choice. Whatever decision we make in a phase of our life is always a financial choice and may rescue us from slipping into poverty. So I would like to thank you, but maybe we have time for a couple of questions from the floor. But I would like to thank the speakers for being so keen in keeping to the time allocated to them.
Ecco lì Grazie, scusate perché il Covid ci costringe a questo.
Sì, sarò troppo breve e quindi mi rivolgo.
Yes, I will be very brief indeed. I would like to ask you a question. Article 53 of the Constitution is our 112 number, is the emergency number. What I heard today concerning public employment is here, but Mr. Gori has enlightened me. So if we don't abide by Article 53, we will have always less income and less services. This is something that nobody mentions, because we have a press or also a public and private TV that has too many news to communicate. Professor Boer, in 2018, I talked to him. He was the chairman of the National Institute for Social Security, and 11 billion are missing from the Social Security funds. Nobody ever mentioned this. We always have to do the direct or indirect taxes. Concerning private Social Security contributions 2018, nobody mentions anything. So what is the question, please? Would you like to ask the question? Well, I would like you to talk about Article 53 and 118. I live in a region with the best healthcare system ever after the region Lombardy. Well, the region Trentino is for sure the best one. Veneto, maybe. Well, then, according to the press and TV, Veneto comes after Lombardy in terms of hospital care. 8 years ago, I was informed that emergency was also present in Mestre. But some people say people have to command and do things where they belong to. So Baroni has to go to Africa and not to Mestre.
Meno. Ho cominciato col più e meno. Ah sì, più o meno.
Aveva promesso brevità,
sì, no,
io mi ero illusa.
No, i comuni.
So you promised you would be brief, and instead, yes, because the municipalities are sustaining a social security burden that is enormous, they should have the possibility of imposing the tax on real estate. Well, I didn't expect this. You were saying very rightly, this is another question. There are money transfers, but we don't have services. Professor Gori was saying that services need time to be delivered, and of course the results will only be visible in future years. My question is this real? Are we actually designing the services? In the case of the base income, it seems that there's no interest in expanding active policies. Who would you like to reply this question? Who would like to reply? Is there anybody here, or? Professor Baldini, would you like to answer the question? Yes, concerning the second question, it is true, it is a very difficult moment as far as the basic income was concerned. We had to contrast material economic poverty, so it was very successful. On that side, we lost 1 million jobs and the possibility to include, therefore, a limited number of people into this scheme. And the law prevented, and the employment centers were shut down during the pandemic, so we had quite a few problems. But efforts are being done, and in this special moment where we have no budget constraints, I hope that some further steps forward will be made, and hopefully also in line with the recovery, because there's no employment demand from the enterprises. It is very difficult to have active people on the market. The major dilemma we're faced with is that on the one side we have an increase in demand for aids. The number of families that are running into difficulties are very many, and they need an immediate, straightforward help. Then we have the structural systems that need a structural reform that will only be providing results in the medium to long term. So it's very hard to resist to those pressures and to provide answers to the legitimate requests for help and aid, and utilize resources for those services that will only be effective in the course of a long time. Providing a money incentive is easier, we know that, but we know that pressure and votes go in a certain direction that is not always coinciding with the rest. We have some data saying that some southern Italy regions have the lowest employment rates as compared to the rest of Europe. Not even Spain or Greece have this very low number of women employed, and the same applies to Turkey. Only the eastern part of Turkey, the most backward Turkish region has a lower number of women in the employment sector. So it is up to us to ask politicians to implement policies that are in favor of women labor and not just immediate money aids. I would also like to say that we have been in Marghera since 2010, and ours is not an intervention that should replace the national service, but should rather become integrated with it and facilitate the access to the labor market for the very many people who are not yet working. And some parameters are still linked with richness, or better, with poverty. So we try to accompany Italian foreign citizens towards working. The first person we had in Marghera was an Italian who had lost his job, had problems with eating and swallow up. He had no money to pay for a dentist, and he had no possibility to pay for a dentist through the national healthcare system. So we had to entertain a constant dialogue with the public offices to respond to his needs. So this is what we've been doing since 2010. So also in the deep north, not just in the deep south. Yes, absolutely. We were saying before that it is true, we're doing the right things at a too late stage in time. So the nursery plan, the self-sufficiency measures, as well as the single allowance or the non-recurrent allowance are all a sign of it. So there's only one thing you can check or double check whether a reform is functioning or not. It's a technical thing. If you are doing the usual things, then of course it means you protect those who can make their voice heard louder. But of course the public sphere considers those who are more disadvantaged in a certain system, so autonomous workers, self-employed, and the likes. And I would like to also mention that we have the issue of universalism and selectivity, as Baldini mentioned before. So you would concentrate the non-recurrent allowance on the lower bracket of our population. But what about the higher bracket of the population? Why should I fund things or measures wherefrom I receive nothing at all? So maybe this is due to social or is linked with social responsibility. I don't want to get to the point where we talk about the 1% taxation, but the people who are at the top could give back something to society.
Voleva rispondere?
You wanted to react?
Allora, non abbiamo l'audio, professoressa.
We can hear you. There I am. I'd like to comment on the second question. We have the citizenship of basic income, which is indeed quite an achievement, because that was not there 2 years ago. But that is not the perfect measure, and it is having critical effects. So the government should be brave enough to do something, to simplify some procedures in order to improve the access for the poor And for the new poors, which were mentioned before, the idea is to activate from the bottom the provision of services and not only of money. There is a lot to be done on that. I'm not referring to pensions or schemes, or I refer to other actions. Well, thank you. I shall be brief. Mr. Gori said that it's important to speak about a selection of actions, because there is a risk of becoming poor, which is increasing. There is a risk for the society to go backward. By watching the pandemics, we have the impression that those who are at a higher risk are those who are into new inequality conditions, which were worsened by the pandemic. For example, the differences in access to digital infrastructure, the availability of devices, and those who are working and learning from home. That is referred to the feature of the house where they live, but also at the level of the community, not only the difference between north and south, but also the periphery, the rural areas, and the difference vis-à-vis the urban area, and all the implications in terms of access to care. Do you think that is a correct interpretation, or from your point of observation, do you think that there are new inequalities or new causes for poverty? That's a very good question. Anyone volunteering? Baldini. It's really a good question. I'm thinking of two groups. First, teenagers. Maybe they are a small percentage, but if we calculate the number of people, that means thousands of young teenagers who are left behind. They could not learn from home. There are many needs who do not study or work or search for employment, so they are not working actively. They do not invest in themselves. That is a number which has gone down in the past 15 years, but it's on the rise because of the pandemic. There are also people in the age of 50s. According to the data, the basic income, usually these are people, one-person families, who are no longer young. They were the target. They were not the target group conceived for the basic income. In the past, we used to think for a person of 30 years of age. Now, not only the Italian population is aging, also the poor are aging. So it's getting more and more difficult to support them. I mean, if you have a person at the age of 30 who has to be retrained is one thing. But if the person is 50, indeed, for many, the basic income is a form of early retirement allowance. That would be a total disaster, because that would mean losing human capital. So there is a dual problem. Young persons abandoning, dropping out from schools, many baby boomers who are unemployed, not only because of the pandemic, but also for the changes in the labor market. And they might be waiting for the pension and not have no incentives to find a job. Well, as there are no other questions, I would like to conclude, because we have been nice. We could entertain questions from the audience. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for participating actively. I'd like to thank the panelists, and we will meet in the afternoon. We'll speak about the core of the festival, i.e. the hands of the state. Thank you. Goodbye.